I'm actually interested in is how gayness, queerness, whatever you call it, interacts with more complex parts of life, like faith, like conservatism, like being an American, like being a Vermonter. And I was very moved that Charity and Sylvia were not perfect role models.
Welcome to the Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. In the early 1800s, Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake spent 44 years as life partners living together in the small town of Weybridge, Vermont. They are now one of the earliest documented lesbian couples in America, thanks in part to a new graphic novel by Tillie Walden. Tillie Walden is a rising star in the cartoon world. She served as Vermont's 5th Cartoonist Laureate from 2023 to March 2026, following cartoon luminaries such as Alison Bechdel and the late New Yorker cartoonist Ed Koren. In 2018, at the age of 22, Walden won the first of her 2 Eisner Awards, known as the Oscars of cartooning, becoming one of the youngest Eisner Award winners ever. Walden's latest book, Charity and Sylvia, has been named the 2026 selection of Vermont Reads, a program of Vermont Humanities that invites communities around the state to read the same book and hold discussions and events. Tillie Walden moved to Vermont from Texas to attend the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction and became a professor there in 2022. Walden, who's now 30, is the author of 16 books. She lives in Norwich with her wife, the cartoonist Emma Hunzinger, and their young son. She had just returned home from a book tour, which is where I caught up with her. Tillie Walden, welcome to the Vermont Conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. So happy to be here.
I want to start with the origin story of Charity and Sylvia, your latest book. First, I'm curious, had you ever heard of this couple? Or was this totally new to you?
Nope. Never heard of them. Had heard of some like historical lesbians along the way, mostly in England, like Anne Lister, stuff like that. Didn't know of any of them in Vermont though. I knew like a little bit of Vermont history. I knew some early American history just because I liked it. But I came across them entirely because Vermont happens to be the only state that has a cartoonist laureate. People still call me a poet laureate, which is funny. And I'm not even the cartoonist laureate anymore. That's been passed on to Stephen R. Bissett. But when I became the laureate of the state, the first email I got was from the director of Vermont Humanities, Christopher Kaufman Ilstrup. And Christopher has been dying for someone to make a comic about these ladies. He's a born and bred Vermonter, also queer. And I met with him. I was pregnant. I was not interested in doing a book. I was interested in just having a baby. But Christopher was like, let me give you this book about Charity and Sylvia, the one book that's been written about them by Rachel Hope Cleaves. And he was like, see what you think. And I was like, yeah, sure. Like, I guess because I'm the state laureate, I'll make you like a short 16-page black and white comic. Like maybe that's all we'll do. And then I'll have my baby and everything will be fine. But I was introduced to these women reading this academic history. I was 1 chapter in when I turned to my wife and I was like, God damn it. This is a book. This is a graphic novel. I had just come off doing like 5 graphic novels in 4 years. I was tired, but my love for these women and for this piece of Vermont history transcended all tribulations. And I told Christopher that I would make him a 250-page book. And then it took 3 years and now the book's out and my son is 2.5.
It makes perfect sense that no turns to 3 years and 250 pages of yes.
Yeah, it's the funny thing about being in an artistic line of work. Inspiration does occasionally trump all. And I was inspired and was like, I think this would be a lot of fun to make a book about.
So the reason I began with had you heard of them was how has there, it turns out, as you just mentioned, there is something about this couple, Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake. There was another, you say, academic work. I understand the Sheldon museum or historical society
Henry
has.
Sheldon Museum. Yep.
Why does anybody have anything on this couple?
Why? Oh my God. Like pure luck and honestly being a good auntie. These are the two reasons. So Charity and Sylvia were very beloved by their nieces and nephews. They were able to be very good aunts because they didn't have their own kids. So they were able to like really tend to them. And they were especially tender to one niece named Sylvia Louisa. Sylvia Louisa grows up, never marries. And when Charity and Sylvia ultimately die, Sylvia Louisa becomes the caretaker of their things. So, like a big old trunk full of like 900 letters, journals, poetry, and a massive adult sized cradle. Because this was back in the days, it comes kind of from the Shaker tradition of laying down in a giant cradle by the fire with some blankets and being rocked. Their cradle was a part of this. So this was like not an easy amount of stuff to hold on to. The giant cradle, the trunk, a few bits and bobs, the silhouette of them that had been cut and decorated with their hair and a beautiful pink paper. Anyways, Sylvia Louisa has all this stuff. She becomes kind of an aging spinster. She never marries. Does this mean she's gay? I don't know, but she did never marry. And when she's getting to the end of her life, she has to figure out what to do with all of Charity and Sylvia's stuff. And they were beloved aunts. And we are so lucky that around that time, Henry Sheldon gets the brilliant idea to open a museum and puts these ads all around town that is basically, imagine I say it in a more 1800s style, give me your junk. He's like, I'll take anything you got. And Sylvia
Okay, well, hold
Louisa,
on. I think you
yeah,
can say it in an 18th century style because you have a whole book of
I did.
reimagining it. So how
Yeah.
would he have said it?
Oh God, I wish I actually had the sheet in front of me to show you because it's brilliant. But it was something like, dearest members of my beloved community, bring forth all objects and oddities that you may have or carry, for I would love to care for them. Um, a long-winded way, bring me your junk. And then the trunk and the cradle and the whole archive end up at the Henry Sheldon Museum, kind of in the basement. And then no one really touches it for like 100 years, maybe longer. And then historians start looking at it more in like the 60s and 70s. But I was just speaking to the director of the Sheldon Museum about this, and she was saying how they were like, huh, what a nice thing. These two women were good friends. No one realized they were gay. They were just like, yep, this is nice. They were friends. This silhouette is cool, this cradle is cool. I guess we won't get rid of it. And then it wasn't until Rachel Hope Cleaves, the historian, was at the Sheldon for another reason. She was researching something else, but had been tipped off about a queer couple in Vermont at this time because Charity's nephew was the American poet William Cullen Bryant. And he had written like 3 paragraphs in one of his books about two maiden ladies who lived in a house encircled by roses and lived as husband and wife. That's sort of verbatim what he said. And so Rachel Hope Cleaves then explores the archive, pulls all this stuff out, and cracks it all open, and writes this beautiful history about them. And because she opened the door, I was able to like just walk right in, charge in, and find all this amazing stuff for this story.
So what was the biggest challenge about recreating the lives of an 18th century lesbian couple? Starting from the language to the
Mhm.
dress, how do you do that?
It's really hard. It's really hard. There
And
are
I should
vast.
add another element
Yeah.
to what they look like, which you
Ugh,
also.
don't even get me started. I don't know what they look like. It still really bothers me. So I had to lean on every little morsel I could find. Luckily, New England is a place of old houses and historical societies. There is a lot of history there. There are letters, there are paintings, there are drawings. The first and big challenge was that Charity and Sylvia were not wealthy. And most historical records save and remember things from fancy houses and fancy people. So I faced a lot of challenges trying to find what sort of a true working class farming Vermont life was like. So that was tricky. The Shelburne Museum helped a lot. A lot of stuff at the Henry Sheldon Museum did help. And we have novels from the time. I used all the novels they read to sort of inspire the language. And of course, I used their own words to inspire the language in the book. A lot of what they say in this historical comic is verbatim from their letters and from their poetry and their journals. So I leaned on what I could find and it came to what they looked like. We have these two tiny, tiny, tiny silhouettes. We have their hair around it, so I know what their hair looked like. But when it came to deciding their faces, it was mentioned in a letter way back when that Charity looked a lot like her brother. So I went to Massachusetts and found the portrait of her brother, and I based her off of what her brother looked like. And then for Sylvia, there is a photograph of her niece, Sylvia Louisa, in her old age in front of Sylvia's brother's house. And I based Sylvia somewhat off of this photograph of her niece. Did Sylvia look exactly like her niece? There's no way. But it gave me a sense of the familial resemblance. But I was reaching. This is the thing with the historical comic is like there were a lot of things that I didn't have answers to. I could have some idea of the chairs they sat in, the tables they worked at, the tools they used to tailor, but in a comic you have to lay it all out like it's a stage, like it's a play in front of you. And so I had to decide, well, I'm putting their table here. I'm putting their fireplace here. I don't know if they use this particular cast iron pot. I don't know if they use this particular stove. You have to decide at a certain point, or you'll just find yourself lost in the historical record for all time and you'll never make a choice. Um,
I was amused. You told the New York Times that to figure out sort of period dress,
yeah,
you look, among other things, you look to your own current neighbors.
I
Um,
did. Yeah.
Say more about that. I think people may be
Yeah.
shocked to hear that people are walking around Norwich, Vermont in long dresses and bonnets and things. So explain.
Yeah, well, it was easy to figure out in a way, like there's a lot of remnants of what people wore. It was very garish. They had the curly hair and the big bonnets and bows, and men had their pantaloons and their top coats and suspenders and all that. But I needed faces. I needed actual human beings to populate Weybridge, Vermont in 1810. And I have a few photos of towns in Vermont from later on, but there was nothing to go off of. So I really did just look at my neighbors and I drew their faces and their bodies and their personalities into the book, because like small town Vermont hasn't changed that much, really. I mean, there's cars, but we're all still, fighting the good fight to get sidewalks made and to get our town to function normally and get our schools to not be bad and get our neighbors to act right and clean up their yard. And that was exactly what they were doing way back when. Only it was a little bit more about like church and farmland, less about sidewalks. Um, so yeah, I just drew them in. There are so many great faces in my town. There's so many great faces in Vermont, and it's a cartoonist is always looking for answers around them. And not only could I use the people of my town, I could use the landscape. Vermont did look different back then. It was largely clear cut because of all the sheep, but it's the same Vermont. I got to use my own street when I drew a few roads in mud season. That's just my road. Those are the ruts that my car can't get through. Same ruts, looked exactly the same. And that was a delight to be able to draw the modern time into this book.
I wonder if you agree with, there's a point in an intense immersive project, such as the 3 years you spent doing this, where you become one with the characters and the place and the time.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I kind of assume that did happen to you. You're living, eating, and breathing it. So, what did it feel like, Tillie, to be a woman of the early 1800s Vermont?
Wow. High highs and low lows. I found that there was so much I felt enmeshed in and adored. The sense of community was addictive. The fact that like when there was news of the town, you had to like run out your door and run to your neighbor and tell them. And more often not, they ran to your house first because you're the tailor and they needed to pick up their new night dress. I loved that. I was riveted by the amount of gossip and drama of just small town living without technology. I was, it's hard to not feel romantic about some of it. The eating dinner by firelight, the labor to sort of get the pie done and eating it with your wife and your sister and your nieces, reading aloud to one another, singing in church being the only music you hear. So I romanticized it in my head. I felt attached to it, but then that was the high highs, but the low lows were like, "Oh, you got a splinter, it got infected, you're dead. Your neighbor, oh, they're dead. I don't know why they're dead. They're just dead. Did the crops fail this year? Nothing to eat. Is the snow covering everything and no one can get to you to help you get more firewood? Is your firewood ruined? Well, you're going to freeze to death. Is it 1816 in July? Well, it's snowing. That's just a thing that happened. Um, and when you're sick and ill, there's no running water to help you. It's the labor and the danger of this time in Vermont is unbelievable. So I didn't want that. And yet I did feel really in it. I felt the tension and the threat of their lives. And it's what made me, what I noticed in the historical archive was how much it seemed to me like they cherished every day they had, because it felt like their mortal career, as they described it, could end at any moment. And often they wrote in their journals where they were like, I think this is it. I think this cold is really gonna, they'd be 20, they were 30, they were 40, and they really thought it was the end. And yet it happened that it wasn't them who fell, it was someone else near them. It was a loved one, it was a niece, it was an aunt, it was a mother. But they managed to live long lives together, which is unbelievable, really.
It's incredible. I mean, because you really paint a vivid picture of how death stalks them and the community. Death is a very much a part of life in that time period. And that cradle you describe was for the many days where they were sick and just needed to be rocked and soothed.
It was the only comfort. You don't have Advil, you don't have Tylenol. It's like it's even work to get like a to heat up a brick, which is a way you would warm a bed up, or to get a cloth with warm water on it was a lot of work. You had to get fetch water from the well, you had to boil it on the fire. And so the cradle was a very quick and easy way to soothe one another. And they often invited neighbors in for a short nap in the cradle, just to take it easy. Because also a lot of times their neighbors would come a long way to get something tailored to bring news of the town, and they didn't want to hoof it back to Middlebury, so they would take a refreshing nap in the cradle before going home.
The way you describe that, I'm kind of thinking, I wonder if I could get an adult cradle on Amazon. That sounds like a really nice place to spend an afternoon.
Yeah, I've always been tempted to just climb into it. It's at the Sheldon Museum now. But I can't, unfortunately. They wouldn't let me.
Um, you told the New York Times that you didn't want to tell another precious queer love story. What do you mean by that? And how do you feel that queer love stories maybe have missed the mark? And how did you set out to change that in your own work?
Well, in any marginalized community, there's a trajectory of how stories are told. And at the beginning of the sort of themes of queerness showing up in a lot of modern comics, because there were a lot of queer themes in underground comics back in the like 70s, 80s, and 90s. But that's, we don't have to get in the weeds of comics history. The point being is that when queer comics sort of hit the mainstream, they were typically coming out stories, and they were stories that revolved around coming to one's identity, accepting it, and then it's kind of like wrap a bow on it and it's all done. Marginalized groups often have to represent themselves in media as very digestible and very acceptable because that's how you find mainstream appeal. And there were times in my career where it felt like what people wanted me to write about was just like write about that it's like hard to be gay, but then it's okay and everything's fine. But what I'm actually interested in is how gayness, queerness, whatever you call it, interacts with more complex parts of life, like faith, like conservatism, like being an American, like being a Vermonter. Um, and I was very moved that Charity and Sylvia were not perfect role models. I thought they were actually kind of bad role models at times, which made them so human to me and so compelling because I think we live
Why
in,
bad?
well, they weren't they didn't have great beliefs about everything. They were sort of vaguely about, believed that slavery was bad, but when push came to shove and they had to actually like help a person of color, they didn't. And I know that because they wrote about it. And it's disappointing to think about, Vermont in their era was a place that spoke a lot of abolition, but could also still be an extremely hostile place. And it was being near Middlebury College was really complex for them because Middlebury espoused itself as somewhere that had very liberal, forward-thinking values, but was also a very difficult place for the people who actually passed through and were from a marginalized group. And so I think it's complex. Also, like there's no way Charity and Sylvia thought women should vote. They didn't think any of that was okay. They weren't activists. They were devout conservative Christians. And at the same time they were gay, and at the same time they were trying to build a productive, beautiful life together. Like my values and Charity and Sylvia's values are quite different, and they weren't always kind. They weren't always accepting of people who were different from them, which is wild because they were different. And that's why I say they were imperfect role models. They weren't living their life to inspire other people to like live their truth. They were hanging on for dear life. They were trying not to get swept away in the current of early America. And to me, that is actually like a fascinating role model, but it doesn't match our idea of a role model in 2026, which is where we expect people in their lives to be emblematic of their beliefs at the time. We expect people to live by what they say they live by. And Charity and Sylvia were too mixed up for that. Not only were they imperfect towards their families, they were imperfect towards each other. They weren't always good partners. They were pretty complex, traumatized women. And that was sort of the name of the game in America at this time, is everyone was kind of broken by
Hmm.
what they were living through. Not only the amount of death and suffering, but by the work that had to be done to survive. Kind of a perpetual state of like exhaustion and short tempers. One of my favorite Charity stories that isn't in the book is just that they were extremely curmudgeonly old people. They were like not a good time. I mean, I love them, but they were grumpy. And they saw like a precious little girl rolling down a hill who I think they were probably related to. And Charity marched over to her and said, "Give this to your mother," and gave her a piece of paper. And this little girl goes home and gives her mother the piece of paper. And it says, "Your daughter was rolling very rudely down a hill," because I think they thought it was very immodest to roll down a hill. And it's like these are the icons I'm working with,
Hmm.
is people who are kind of mean to a little girl who's having a really good time rolling down a hill. And yet I love them and I cherish them and I appreciate them. And it is their complexities that I was so interested in. So that's why I say it wasn't so much a precious queer story, because they're not a lot of stories, especially for younger audiences, even though this is an adult book and kind of for everyone. But a lot of stories they're cocoons for kids. They only show them the safe things. They only give them the lesson. We've created a lot of very padded rooms in a lot of stories, especially in comics. I'm much interested in touching on things that feel darker or things that feel yeah, just more complex. Queer people aren't perfect. No marginalized person is perfect. No person anywhere is perfect.
Well, let's go to another of your works where you
Yeah.
talk about somebody who's very complex and messy, yourself, and that's your 2016 graphic memoir,
I
Spinning.
agree with that one.
Well, that could be said about anybody, but you put yourself out there with this. And is it accurate to call that, do you call it a graphic memoir?
I do. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that term. Yeah.
So, and I do have a personal connection to that world, though not yours specifically. My wife was also a competitive figure skater and getting up at 4 a.m. for
Oh my God.
many of the years before I knew her. So
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by learning more about it through you. But
Oh,
in your
cool.
depiction of it, it's a very kind of tormented time and even
Completely.
has the power while you were drawing it and describing it to kind of elicit panic attacks in you as you were drawing skating.
Yeah.
So I wonder,
A mess.
talk, a mess. Okay. Talk about the why and how you chose to depict that part of your life and
Mhm.
what you think, how you think you as a cartoonist drew inspiration from you as a skater.
Absolutely. I think it's connected to what I was saying about being interested in the complexity and within myself when I see pain, kind of when I notice a bruise in my own story, in my own childhood, I kind of want to push on it. I think that the fact that when I would draw myself ice skating, which I just did in cartoon school randomly for a little assignment, and I started drawing my legs and I had a panic attack, like immediately, just trying to draw my little legs. I was
Your
like,
legs, your skating legs, or just
my
your
skating
legs?
legs. No, only my legs in tights. It was very intense for me. There's a
Why?
lot about, well, the body. You're very exposed when you're a figure skater. We weren't allowed to wear underwear. You had to just wear your tights and your little dress and then basically kind of like spread your legs for the judges. And I was always freezing. I was always so scared and anxious and to put myself out there. I was a very unhappy figure skater. Some people love it, and more power to you. But the fact that I my childhood elicited this response, especially when drawing, and drawing was kind of my safe haven, made me very curious. And I really wanted to write about it. And I felt like I wanted to make this memoir about my childhood and understand where is all this panic and fear coming from? Why does my 12 years as a figure skater scare me? And why do I not like thinking about it? And I think for some people that would mean, well, don't make a book about it. Like you're freaked out. And for me, I was like, obviously, I'm gonna make a comic about it right away. I didn't want to wait until I had sussed out why I was feeling this way. I didn't want to be healed. I wanted to make the book while I was still feeling pretty broken. Um, and it was an illuminating experience. It was horrible and fabulous, and I grew a lot. And now I'm 30, and I feel I understand my childhood so much more. But I would have made a very different book had I made it at 30 and not at 18 or 19 when I made it.
So,
Um,
how do you feel like what you learned on the ice is carried on in what you do on the page now?
Oh God, I mean it's entirely about the discipline. I spent so many years under the thumb of coaches who had very high expectations for me, who made it very clear that you should suffer and work hard every day for probably like 6 to 8 years, and maybe then you'll only be okay at it. You're not going to be great. And when I took that into cartooning, I took that into art, and I told myself, you're going to work at this every single day. And maybe in 6 years, you'll be okay at drawing. And it's true. In 6 years, I was like, okay, I was pretty good at drawing. And now, 12 years, I'm very good at drawing. But I knew that it was going to take time. I knew that it was going to take failure. And I knew, like, when you're skating, you jump and you fall and you get back up again. And I think there's this idea that in a creative life, you're inspired and you draw and it's great. No, I make a lot of bad drawings and I throw them out and I do it again because I know that that is part of the process. And so I've made a lot of books really fast in these last 12 years. And it's entirely because of how I trained and how I was raised. And if anything, I'm just now learning how to slow down because there's no reason I'm realizing to push myself so much, especially when like I have a toddler. It's like I have new priorities in my life that need to be tended. I can't just hustle every minute.
How has motherhood changed your work as a cartoonist?
Oh, it's changed it so much. It's made it easier and harder. It makes the time that I do have to draw so precious because it feels, I mean, anyone who has a young child knows how it feels to get a little time for yourself and your own pursuit. It's intoxicating. But at the same time, when I'm with my son and especially when we're all together as a family, I know I'm experiencing something that is like rewiring who I am as a person, which is going to rewire who I am as a writer. You really put yourself on the back burner and your kid and their milestones and their interests and their growth becomes kind of the main storyline, and it's amazing watching someone grow and become who they are is it's the best. I love it.
Your wife, Emma Hunziker, is like you, a cartoonist, and you took the very brave chance to collaborate on a book, My Parents Won't Stop Talking. So, talk about working together with your spouse, the joys and challenges of that.
I'm really lucky. I have a wife who not only I adore being married to, but who I also work very well with. And this has to do with the fact that we have very different strengths as cartoonists and very different interests. I'm the somber one, she's the funny one. If we're doing heart, I'm all here. If we're doing funny, it's Emma. Emma loves drawing people. I like drawing backgrounds. I like drawing places. I like shading and coloring. Emma likes outfits and specific details. And so when we worked on a picture book together, we wrote it together. So we just made each other laugh because she told me she remembered being trapped as a kid at church with her parents talking to people, and all she wanted to do was go home, but her parents would not stop talking. So that was the inspiration for the book. It's just chatty parents and a kid who really can't escape it. And then we drew it together. She drew all the people, I drew all the backgrounds, and I would color it and she would hover over me and be like, "What about that color? What about that color?" And and we got lucky. If we had different temperaments or we were both really good at drawing people, maybe it would be different, but somehow we fit together as a creative team, and we'd love to make more books together. We're just waiting for her to finish her current book so we can do it.
Wow, that is the nicest description of collaborating with your spouse on a project that I think I've ever heard.
I
It's
don't know. Yeah,
heartwarming.
we literally won the lottery. We don't win the lottery in any other sense in life, both being freelancers and cartoonists with a child, but in the creative sense, we have won the big prize because we love working together.
So, in on another creative inspiration note, you have as fellow Vermont cartoon laureates,
Yes.
some really remarkable people, all of whom I've interviewed. Well, not all of them, but
Have
interviewed
you gotten to
Allison.
Steve yet?
I didn't know, but Alison Bechdel, Ed Koren, the late great Ed Koren, and I wonder what inspiration who you point to as role models in your work, and what inspiration do you take from your fellow Vermont cartoonist laureates?
Oh God, I mean, I'm inspired by all of them. I read a lot of their comics when I was young. I read Fun Home. I read James Kochalka. I remember seeing Ed Koren's work in the New Yorker. It was all swimming around me. I got lucky in that when I was growing up, when I was at the perfect age to be influenced by media, like 10 or 11, was when a kind of renaissance of comics took place. This is when we started getting Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, Blankets by Craig Thompson, Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, all of these fabulous, specifically graphic memoirs. So I was very influenced, obviously, because I turned around and did a graphic memoir as soon as I could, by all of these people kind of bearing their souls on the page. I mean, just looking at Persepolis, Blankets, and Fun Home, and they're all comics about very complex lives and very difficult situations. So I was very influenced by all of their work. I was really influenced by manga. I grew up reading a lot of comics from Japan. I specifically read a lot of shonen manga, which is manga targeted for boys, but because I was a little lesbian, I loved it. And what I loved about manga was how endless it was. I would start one story and I had like 30 volumes to get through. And it's like these stories are still going on. The creative output in Japan really influenced me.
Explain what
Still
manga
does.
is for people who are not familiar with
So
it.
manga is literally the Japanese word for comics, and it refers to the industry of work being made in Japan. And they are typically mangas for kids, although everyone reads it. And it's either targeted for boys or girls, shonen or shoujo, and they tend to be big adventure stories. If you've ever heard of like Dragon Ball or Naruto, that's manga. It's protagonists coming up against huge challenges, and these stories go on for thousands of pages, thousands. Like we think American comics are big, we got nothing. We got nothing on manga. They're doing way more than we are. But manga is also often made by a team of people. There's like a lead artist, and then there's a lot of assistants. And this is how you make thousands and thousands of pages, is when someone is helping you out with the details. Tezuka was a big influence. He's one of the most famous manga artists. He did Astro Boy, a series called Buddha. But what I loved about Japanese comics is they're all black and white. And I loved being able to see the lines that the artists actually made. And one of the reasons I never connected with mainstream comics in America, like Marvel or DC, is because I found them so garishly colored and such a like sensory overload. I couldn't parse what I was looking at. But manga was just, one line for a leg, a few quick lines for the hair. And I felt it reminded me of like early Calvin and Hobbes, Bill Watterson, how you can just see a few brushstrokes and he makes like a perfect child out of it.
How would
So
you describe your style?
how would oh God, pseudo realistic. It's like it's kind of like, oh, it's not too different from something like what Allison does. It's comics based in realism, but like mildly stylized because nothing is quite perfect. I tend to cartoon the faces in a way that are like a little unrealistic, and you can see a little bit of the manga influence in how I draw eyes. I don't really know. And my style has changed a lot and it looks different in different books. Like spinning is very quick and loose, and Charity and Sylvia is much tighter. But
And you
yeah,
draw by hand.
I draw by hand, I letter by hand, everything by hand. I will never
That's,
use a font in my book ever again. No, wait, ever. Not ever again. I've never done it. I never will.
isn't that pretty old school?
Very old school. And my students are so sick of me being like, draw the words, put the iPad away, get some pencil, get some paper. You learn to make art faster if you work traditionally. And what's unfortunate is students then work on paper and it's hard. And I'm like, yeah, that's the whole point. It's like it's supposed to be challenging, but all digital media, when you're drawing digitally, is a copy, it's a replication of a traditional media. So there's like a watercolor brush on the iPad. You you need to understand how water actually works on paper before you grab an iPad. But I'm also, let's be fair, I'm like a Luddite. I'm one of those Gen Zers who eschews a lot of modern technology. So it's not surprising that I drew this book with a fountain pen.
You did not attend college, but you did get a graduate degree at the
Well, I
Center
got a
for.
certificate, but yes.
Tell me about that. That's your own personal path there.
Yeah. My poor parents were not
That's what I
happy
was
and very,
thinking.
very confused when I was
Yeah.
like, I'm not going to go to college and I'm going to get a 2-year certificate in cartooning at the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction, Vermont. They were baffled. I was
And
not baffled. I knew what I was doing. Well, I thought I was going to go to cartoon school and it was going to be a lot of fun. And then I thought maybe I'd go to college after, maybe I'd just get a job and work. And I kind of thought I would be like Pam from The Office. I'd be a receptionist and I'd draw my comics on the side. I never wanted like a complex job. I just wanted to make ends meet and draw. That's all I wanted. So yeah, I went to CCS, and while I was there, I started finding some success. Not much monetary success, but like people were noticing my art online, and I took it and ran with it. And so that question of maybe I'll go to college later just kind of disappeared, and I started making comics full time when I graduated when I was 20.
And you grew up in Texas? Is that right?
I did. I half of my life in New Jersey, half in Texas, but I consider myself from Texas.
And Vermont, the move to Vermont was because of the Center for Cartoon Studies?
It was, yeah. So thank God CCS wasn't in Alabama, or I guess I'd be in Alabama right now. But it happened to be in Vermont, and I happened to love it. And I left after I graduated because everyone was telling me, you're 20, you have to see the world. You can't just settle in Vermont right away. And I listened to them, and I went and lived all over the world. And then when I was a little older, I was like, okay, I'm gonna settle back in Vermont, which is what I wanted to do this whole time.
So, all over the world are young people who are doodling, maybe even making art, but the idea of making a life of this, of becoming a professional cartoonist, how do you know? What is your advice to young artists, young cartoonists, for how they should know that this is their one and true calling?
Well, everyone I talk to who makes comics, all my students, even when they are somewhat tortured by what they do, they find it challenging, they find it frustrating, they do within themselves feel compelled to make a comic. So, like right off the bat, if you feel an inclination towards making comics, that's significant. Most people don't. Most people would rather do something else. But if you think that putting pictures in boxes and sequentially telling a story sounds like a good time, you might be a cartoonist. And the thing to do with that, the thing that really separates sort of people who imagine making comics and the people who make them professionally is that you have to begin the tiresome process of externalizing everything. Every kid I meet who wants to make comics has a huge story in their head that they think about every night, that they imagine, that they occasionally doodle. But the thing they never do is actually tell the story. And what they always tell me is, I'm not ready, I'm not good enough. And the way to become a cartoonist is to tell the story when you're not good enough. You can't wait. There is no waiting. There is no good enough. You have to start externalizing everything that is internal that you imagine. And when you start doing that, that is when you start to become a cartoonist. And I don't actually think you need to be publishing work and making a ton of money to be a professional cartoonist. You just need to be making and finishing every comic you make. This is what most people struggle with is you start your idea, you make 2 pages, it looks great, and then you don't like it anymore. So you don't finish it or you run into a challenge. But this happens to me on literally every graphic novel I've ever made. I get 3 pages in and I'm like, this is stupid. I don't want to do this anymore. But the reason I'm a professional is I ignore that voice and I finish the book, regardless of how it feels, because art is something that requires follow through. It's not as imaginative and creative as people think. It really is like clocking in. You have to show up for your art and really take it to completion. And my big advice for anyone aspiring to do this is learning to accept your art as it is. Because you might make a finished comic and realize it's not everything you dreamt it would be, but that's just part of the process. It's nothing is ever as perfect as it is in our head. When we actually draw, we're faced with like human problems. Drawing is hard. Your wrist hurts. I don't know how to draw a spaceship. Like you have to figure all this stuff out. And accepting where you are at is the first step in really becoming excellent at this. You can't be excellent if you're not bad for a while.
I feel like I hear the young Tillie Walden figure skater saying, "Get back up,
Get back
do it
up.
again,
Suck
ignore
it
the
up.
pain."
Turn off your phone, throw it in the lake, disconnect your internet, and get some goddamn paper and draw.
What's next for you, Tillie?
Absolutely nothing. I am so tired, and my child is so young. I think I'm just gonna watch my kid and help my wife out so she can do a book, and maybe I'll do a comic in a year or two. But right now, all that's up is Charity and Sylvia. You can read that, and I'll see you in 5 years.
I have a hunch it's going to be a lot sooner than that,
I
but
know it always
I won't
happens like
hold you
that.
to that. Anyway, Tillie Walden, it's been a real pleasure talking to you on the Vermont Conversation.
Thank you so much.
Tillie Walden was the fifth Cartoonist Laureate of Vermont. Her new graphic novel is Charity and Sylvia, which has been named the 2026 Vermont Reads book selection. That does it for this week's Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. Thanks so much for listening.